Yeah. So let me go directly into this next presentation to make sure we give as much time as possible for a full-on discussion as a group at the end. So I'm going to share the screen again right now. And hopefully you should all be seeing something that says Part 2, an ecological civilization in practice. So, well, to begin with, we can start really from those principles that we ended up with at the end of that last presentation, these principles that ecosystems themselves have relied on for flourishing over millions of years. And there's a lot to hold, these kind of 7 principles, but we kind of distill that in a way into 3 more foundational ones that you can keep with you as we're looking at these applications for human society. Basically, is this principle of integration, of like unity, being part of a unified whole with diversity, the principle of mutually beneficial symbiosis that we talked about, and that principle of fractal flourishing. And in the first part of this presentation, we're going to look at how these principles apply in practice all across. We're not just talking, when we're talking about ecological civilization, we're not just talking about changing our economy, but every aspect, like distribution of wealth, technology and infrastructure, governance, culture, and how we relate to the living earth. And we can begin maybe by drilling down one level more on that principle of fractal flourishing I mentioned. Basically, what that means is at the individual level, meaning setting the conditions for true individual dignity with adequate housing for all, competent healthcare, quality education, safety and security. It means that the next fractal layer of the society, the societal health requires things like reduced inequality, integrated communities, respect for diversity, and restorative justice for those who have been so oppressed, as we were exploring in that last, in the first presentation. And then, or the greater context of Earth, a flourishing Earth with abundant wildlife, elimination of pollutants, regenerative practices. So now let's begin looking at some of the economic elements of what an ecological civilization might mean. Well, it would require a drastic reduction in this extreme global income inequality, with a just transition from the fossil fuel economy and things like a global wealth tax, a universal basic income, and property returned to the commons. And we'll look at a couple of these in a little more detail, beginning with this notion of the commons. The commons we can understand basically as referring to any source of sustenance and well-being that hasn't yet been appropriated, either by the state or by private ownership. So the commons refers to everything from all the contributions nature gives to our well-being, like the atmosphere, fresh water, sunshine, soil, the oceans, and all the contributions that our human heritage has given us over hundreds of thousands of years, like language, cultural traditions, technical know-how, and then more recently, scientific knowledge. And sort of to understand the commons, we can kind of look at that historically and build up the sense of the great wealth available to all of us, starting from over the lifetime of the earth, the things like the atmosphere, water, and sunshine. And then with the evolution of humans, things like language, cultural traditions, and technology. Then with the rise of civilizations over the last couple of thousand years, things like writing, law, civilization itself, and specialized knowledge. In the last few centuries, benefits like electricity, industrialization, and global markets. In just the last few decades, the amazing benefits, things like microprocessors, computer code, and the internet. And when we recognize all this is available to our total human collective, then we see that you get something like a company that took all that global commons and did a few tweaks to it. And let's call it like, say, Facebook as an example. What we then realize is that Facebook or any of these other companies merely added a few little incremental tweaks to this incredible treasure trove of global commons. But meanwhile, in our society, that allows somebody like Mark Zuckerberg to have a net worth of like $75 billion. Well, 4 billion other human beings on this earth earn less than $7.40 a day, the minimum income. people need for basic nutrition and a normal life expectancy. We have to ask, is that not like one of the greatest moral egregiousnesses in all of history? And so fundamental to an ecological civilization would be something that capped those billionaires' wealth and transferred that money to all of us, because the wealth really is not in what that one person did, but in the commons. So we can look at that notion of the commons as really being like the commonwealth. We can kind of retake that word and apply that to the wealth available to all human beings. And that wealth can be distributed to all human beings using basically something that has already been tried and tested around the world, this notion of a universal basic income, which is the concept of giving an income to every person alive on this earth, sufficient to actually give them the basics they need for that dignity, the adequate housing, the adequate food, etc. It's based on this idea that everyone alive has a moral right to share in that commonwealth. And it's recognizing that rather than, from our dominant worldview, people think, oh, you can't do that. People are just lazy. They'll just squander the money. And they'll, actually the opposite is true. Purposeful work is an integral part of human flourishing. And people have a fundamental need to feel valued by community. And in these places around the world where these UBI pilot programs have been tried, these programs consistently report when this universal basic income is given, no questions asked, to a group of people, a reduction in crime, child mortality, malnutrition, truancy, teenage pregnancy, alcohol consumption, and an increase in things like health, gender equality, school performance, and entrepreneurial activity. So that's one fun big piece of that. Now let's turn our attention to those corporations that we were looking at earlier, kind of devouring the world. In an ecological civilization, they would exist for humanity rather than for shareholder returns. Some of you may be familiar with concepts already there in the world today, like benefit corporations and B Corp certifications, where corporations can choose to change their articles of incorporation. So they legally have to consider the impact of their decisions on workers, customers, suppliers, community, environment. A few enlightened companies have made that choice, but there's only been a few thousand worldwide. And of course, it's had virtually zero impact on our society as a whole because it's voluntary, and the big corporations wouldn't dream of doing that. So in an ecological civilization, the triple bottom line of not just profit, but also people and planet, like we see in those B Corps, would be required for corporate charters. This would fundamentally reorganize these transnational corporations. They could only have their charters renewed every few years, and the discretion of community-based panels chosen by sortition to reduce the risk of corruption that would evaluate whether they actually met each of those three bottom lines. And corporations would be subject, just like right now they worry about financial bankruptcy, they'd be subject to social or environmental bankruptcy if they failed to meet all of those. So it would be something that would be fully enforced, and that would change the intrinsic character of the corporation. So imagine, for example, there's some copper mine somewhere that a company has the potential to exploit. Right now, the current situation is these company executives and board are driven, they have to maximize shareholder value. So of course they're going to choose to exploit it to the extent they can. If they didn't, their share price would decline. They'd be at risk of being sued by shareholders. And meanwhile, that mine, even no matter how polluting it is, would be acquired by a more ruthless competitor. So they say, well, got no choice. Under a triple bottom line requirement, we'd see balanced decision-making, where those risks of pollution, the needs of community would be applied to all the other factors. And just like we do as regular human beings when we make a decision, they'd optimize all three bottom lines rather than just that shareholder profit. Meanwhile, a lot of focus would move from corporations themselves to worker-owned co-ops, which are designed to, based on these principles like equity and fairness, solidarity, social responsibility, dignity, and respect. And they generally have a much fairer pay ratio between executives and workers, with primacy given to the welfare of employees, customers, and community, and more of a long-term orientation than short-term profit. And cooperatives can scale successfully in every way just as much as these transnational corporations. A great example is the Mondragon Cooperative in Spain, founded by a Catholic priest in Basque Country in the 1950s. It now has over 80,000 employees, over 250 companies in areas ranging from finance to consumer goods, capital equipment, retail. And still in these companies, the CEO receives no more than 6 times the salary of the lowest paid worker. In the economy as a whole, we'd move toward a circular economy, which increases employment while reducing waste, with products designed for repair and recycling, sourced from recycled materials, with waste virtually eliminated. And crucially, there would be full cost pricing required for all goods, which basically means that the pricing in each good would incorporate the full ecological cost in a product's complete life cycle. So it would internalize these costs that right now are externalized, with the result that something like that plastic bag that right now is dirt cheap would become super expensive. Something like that jute bag would actually be cheaper because it doesn't have all of those externalized costs. When we look at cities, they would be designed on ecological principles, with community gardens on every block, with extensive use of energy efficient designs, rooftop gardens, aquaponics. Cars would be banned from the city centers, and essential services would always be within a 20-minute walk, encouraging that community interaction. Outside of the cities, in the countryside, agroecology would replace global industrial monocrops based on principles of permaculture and regenerative agriculture, leading to greater crop biodiversity, greater water and carbon efficiency, virtual elimination of synthetic fertilizer, and in time, the elimination of factory farming. And studies have shown that agroecology, based on these principles, can be as productive as industrial agriculture, but without all the devastating effects that it causes. Then we can move to how technology might look. Basically, right now, when we look at how our technology works that so dominates our lives today, it's based on centralized control. Well, those companies like Facebook or Uber or Google or Amazon or Airbnb, no matter what they are, even though they sometimes talk about putting the giving more agency to people, actually they control all the information. But using modern blockchain technology and what's known as the distributed ledger, technology can be redesigned so the control is decentralized, where each party holds their agency over what they do with the data. This kind of distributed ledger can empower and protect collective action, enable people to cooperate and coordinate at large scale. And in modern, people are looking increasingly about how this can be applied to things like property law, money systems, enterprise structures. There's this notion of a distributed autonomous organization, where organizations themselves can be owned by the usage rather than who has the wealth. Information ownership, and even reformulating how democracy itself can work. Then looking at just our political structures, rather than necessarily looking at these state lines and country lines, which essentially were just based on past political history of conquest, we'd be looking at society organized based on bioregions. This is a map of what California, for example, might look like if we're actually organized as separate societies based on bioregions, because regions have different needs and affinities based on their ecological context. It would mean that communities could connect more with their land rather than these global flows from globalization. And it would emphasize local production leading to local consumption to the greatest extent possible. The way we would measure the success of our entire society would be very different. Rather than GDP, or gross domestic product, which basically just measures the rate at which these corporations are extracting and monetizing essentially the living earth and monetizing human activity. We'd be looking at indicators such as the genuine progress indicator, which is one that's actually used right now, which factors in negatives like income inequality, environmental pollution and crime, and factors in positives like volunteer work, household work, or education. That's just one of a number of different types of measures that are being explored around the world to look at true well-being. On the global level, we'd be looking at a far more muscular United Nations with enforcement powers over that global commons, the oceans, atmosphere, ecosystems, fresh water. We'd be seeing at the UN the declaration of a rights of nature that would put the natural world on the same legal standing as humanity. And we'd be looking at personhood being given, as is happening in a few cases now, to ecosystems, rivers, high-functioning mammals. And ecocide, the destruction of whole ecosystems, would be defined as an international crime. Then just shifting our attention to the sense of our culture and community. Right now, most of our cultural systems are designed based on what the fabulous writer Riane Eisler calls domination systems, which basically are the authoritarian and hierarchical social and economic structures that we see around us, with a high degree of abuse and violence. Basically, the patriarchy we see around us, which subordinates women and quote unquote femininity to males and masculinity. And it propagates beliefs and stories that justify and idealize that domination and violence. And as Riane Eisler has shown really powerfully, what we can shift to in an ecological civilization is more of a partnership system with more equitable structures, socially equal valuing of males and females, mutual respect and trust with a low degree of violence, and beliefs and stories that give value to empathic and caring relations. And of course, part of that begins with education, which would also be re-envisioned. Like right now, our mainstream education, the objective of it is to prepare students to be good corporate citizens in the corporate marketplace, get them to base their lives on values like selfishness, individualism, nationalism. And of course, that maintains the system of divisiveness, exploitation, and extraction. So we'd be looking at reformulating education to be life-affirming, preparing students to pursue well-being and that fractal flourishing, and to live according to values of cooperation, collaboration, imagination, creativity, community orientation, and basically moving towards that partnership society we just looked at. Fundamentally, what we would be looking at is a transformation in values, one with an emphasis on the quality of life rather than material possessions, prioritizing progress in that quality, not the quantity of stuff, basing our political, social, and economic choices on a sense of our shared humanity, emphasizing justice and dignity for all, and building our civilization's future on the basis of symbiosis with the living earth, where the flourishing of the natural world would be a foundational principle. As I said in that earlier presentation, culture shapes values, values shape history, and it's our values that will shape the future, which probably has led many of you now to be asking, well, okay, it looks great, but how will those values shape the future? How can we actually get there? We're so far from there right now. So let's take a look in these last few minutes about how change actually happens. The most important thing to understand is that it follows a non-linear path. And when social scientists look at change, they show that if you look at sort of the amounts of public support new ideas have over time, that begins with sometimes a very long and slow early adoption phase, where you deal with what people call ideological lock-in, where people are stuck with their received attitudes and opinions even when they become outdated. There's social rigidity. there's political inertia. And the main thing those people who are the early adopters hear around them is, it'll never happen. But then at a certain point, there's a tipping point occurs. And when that tipping point happens, you begin to experience a crescendo of change where influential thought leaders attract increasing numbers of people. There's a natural herd instinct that we have as humans because of our shared sense of community, but that shifts the direction towards the new thinking. And the stickiness of the old thinking gets to be superseded by the pull of the new idea, leading ultimately to widespread adoption, where those new ways of thinking have become institutionalized. There's still some diehard reactionaries, but now they're in the minority. And then the thing that you generally hear around you is, oh, it was inevitable. It had to happen. So what are some examples of that? Well, we can look at the inspiring example, for example, of women's suffrage. It wasn't much more than a century ago when women anywhere in the world had no ability to vote. Emmeline Pankhurst founded the National Union for Women's Suffrage in England in 1897. It took her 10 years just to muster up a few thousand people to go on a march in London for the women's right to vote in 1907. And just a couple of decades later, women were getting the right to vote in the UK and the US, followed by other countries all around the world. We see that in the civil rights movement in the United States in 1955. Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted over a year. Black churches were burned. Black citizens were arrested. It seemed to many people like a hopeless cause at the time. And less than 10 years later, there was a March on Washington, 1963, with over 200,000 people, that famous speech from Martin Luther King Jr., I Have a Dream. And the Civil Rights Act was passed the next year into law by President Johnson. And we see similar kinds of nonlinear shifts even in more recent times, such as like the MeToo movement. Actually, that phrase MeToo was first used by civil rights activist Tarana Burke in just 2006 to raise awareness of sexual assault. It never occurred to her that roughly 10 years later, that hashtag MeToo would go viral. That Harvey Weinstein, presumed to be, one of these people who were untouchable, arrested for sexual assault. And that hashtag would potentiate this movement. It still has a long way to go, but potentiate that movement to transform abusive cultural norms around the world. But maybe the most valuable case study to look at is the rise of neoliberalism itself. And this is worth taking a closer look at. Back in 1947, there was this society founded by one of the founders of neoliberal thought, Friedrich Hayek, called the Mont Pelerin Society. And he saw this great danger in what was occurring at the time after the war of the expansion of government. So the declared objective of this Mont Pelerin Society was things like preserving and reaffirming private property rights, a moral code for public and private activity, and limiting state actions by the rule of law, and in their words, the right of each individual to plan his own life. And this was considered way outside of normal political discourse at the time. But over a few years, Hayek and the people who founded this society attracted so-called free market, like economists, business leaders, and journalists. You'll see the names on this screen. You probably recognize some of them. And these institutions like the Cato Institute and Heritage Foundation that have become so influential in the world around us. And by the time Ronald Reagan was doing his campaign in 1980, there's an amazing statistic of the 76 economic advisors on his staff, 22 of them were members of the Mont Pelerin Society. And with that kind of influence that they inculcated around the world, the result was the neoliberal world order, with the election of people like Reagan and Thatcher in that period. And so some of these statements that became sort of resonated around the world that have led to the foundation of the modern dominant ideology, like Reagan, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem, or this idea of trickle-down economics, or Margaret Thatcher's notion that there is no alternative, in her words, to this market liberal states, or there's no such thing as society, she even said. People must look after themselves first. All of these came from this thinking that got sort of seeded by that Mont Pelerin society a couple of decades earlier. And that led to this incredible success for them in terms of these results, where the elites have now managed to grow their wealth massively, even while the bottom 90% of people's wealth has declined since that time when Reagan and Thatcher were elected, right around 1980. And that elite wealth, measured by that GDP, has come at the expense of welfare and happiness of the public as a whole. You remember that measurement of GPI, Genuine Prosperity Index, that actually peaked at 1978, right when neoliberalism took over, and has declined ever since. And this is an interesting conclusion by a neoliberal reviewer of a history of the Mont Pelerin Society. And in his words, when he looks at this, he says, thought precedes action. Think tanks and ideas indeed have consequences. Ideas, good or bad, triumph in the end. Good or bad, triumph in the end. And when we look at that neoliberal paradigm shift, we see what it basically was about is they took all of these different elements like regulatory controls or eliminate taxes, demolish organized labor. These are all separate ideas and tactics, but they were all under the umbrella of this concept of the freedom of the individual. We can think of that as like a shared network of meanings, that all the people around the world working on these different elements all recognized they shared the same umbrella of where they were moving to. And what they accomplished was shifting what's known as the Overton window. Now, Overton is the name of one of those neoliberal theorists around that time. And he coined the term to talk about the range of policies that are politically acceptable to mainstream discourse at a particular time. So that's the Overton window. And what is not in the window is unthinkable for most people in the society. And if you look at where neoliberalism was at when Hayek first founded that Mont Pelerin Society, it was outside of the window of acceptable discourse. It wasn't beyond radical. It wasn't even thinkable. But what the Mont Pelerin Society did over the decades was help move it from unthinkable to mainstream policy. They shifted the window. So they didn't shift their ideas. They shifted the window of discourse until they became mainstream. So now if we look at the ecological civilization paradigm shift we need, we can look at these different things we've just been talking about: revoking corporate powers, agroecology, grassroots democracy, circular economy. But we need to recognize that all of these have to be part. Remember that notion of integration, unity with differentiation. All these parts have to be part of the shared network of meaning to move toward a life-affirming civilization. So the challenge for those of us who want to see that shift is basically, over the decades to come, reversing that Overton window and moving it so that neoliberalism becomes unthinkable. Growth-based capitalism itself becomes a radical idea, and we move closer and closer towards the potential for a true ecological civilization. And the way in which that can happen, again, maybe one of the great scions of neoliberalism, he kind of described it better than anyone. He's Milton Friedman. He talked about how only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. In his words, that I believe is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And of course, right now, we're experiencing a meta crisis in the world. And these are just some of the great trailblazers moving us towards this potential for an ecological civilization, to that place where we can shift that Overton window. So what we have to realize that right now, our current civilization is unraveling. And as it unravels from its inherent contradictions, the potential increases for it to be rewoven with the best ideas that are lying around. that the real challenge for us is to reweave the current civilization, to transform it from within without it first collapsing, causing devastation for basically all of us. So that's our challenge. So then when we look at this potential for ecological civilization itself to experience that tipping point, well, one thing that is both terrifying but also actually allows for the possibility of this shift is the magnitude of the crisis we're facing: the climate emergency, the global inequality, the environmental collapse, the breakdown of political norms. And the rise of the internet, even though we're very aware of the damaging effect it has with the siloization, it also has led to the increased transmittal speed of new ideas and an emergent global sense of a shared humanity. So this shift towards an ecological civilization, and if it were to occur, it would be a major shift. And of course, the challenge we have is we only have a few decades to do it at most. And we have to make that shift intentionally. We have to consciously change our own values and behavior and those of people around us. But if we were to make that happen, it would be one of these great transitions in human history, such at the depth and profundity of like the ones that moved from hunter-gatherers to agriculture, or from agriculture to the scientific revolution. And I noticed somebody put this point in the chat, that we'd actually be moving essentially from what we all recognize right now as the Anthropocene to a different era for humanity, which has been called by Glenn Albrecht, the Symbiocene. So the Anthropocene, as many of us know, defines the modern era that shifted from the Holocene. And it's based on this ideology of human supremacy when human impact reaches geological proportions. It's destructive of life and biodiversity, and it's inherently unstable. And with the vision of the Symbiocene, which would be the period that would usher in that ecological civilization, would be based on the principle of that symbiosis, of the mutually beneficial flourishing of humans and the living earth, where we'd use technology for those regenerative, life-affirming practices. And that period could potentially be very long-lived on the earth. Basically, we humans could become like a civilization learning how to tend Mother Earth. The magnitude of this change is a daunting proposition, but I do want to leave with you those powerful words that some of you may know from Margaret Mead. And she said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." So thank you for that. And now I'll come out of screen share.